A whisper lost in the cathedral stones, a secret buried beneath centuries of shadow, and a deception so carefully crafted, it nearly rewrote history itself. In this tale, truth hides behind robes, maps, and the echoes of ancient chants, until logic tears through the fog. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a bleak November morning that I found myself once again before the glowing hearth of our shared sitting room at 221B Baker Street. Outside, the rain fell with the steady rhythm of a metronome, drumming against the windows, as if eager to announce something unspeakable. Sherlock Holmes, however, remained entirely indifferent to the inclement weather, his lean figure half submerged in an armchair, long fingers steepled beneath his chin. For 3 days he had barely spoken, absorbed as he was in a curious assortment of ecclesiastical diagrams and architectural sketches of Westminster Abbey. From time to time, he would mutter something inaudible or mark a point on the parchment with a flick of his pencil, and I, accustomed though I was to his eccentricities, found myself unsettled by this particular silence. There was, I thought, a peculiar weight in his stillness, like the air before a thunderclap, though what storm he anticipated I could not yet say. Holmes did not so much glance at me as he did the folded page that lay open upon his knee, a crumbling vellum sheet torn from what appeared to be a church registry. Its corner had been folded not once, but twice, the crease creating a deliberate mark over a single line. Arnold, Burr, arrived for cloistered retreat, Oct. 230. The name meant nothing to me then, but the gleam in Holmes' eye betrayed a deeper knowledge, or at least an expectation confirmed. He did not speak. Instead, he tapped the name lightly with his forefinger, as if summoning something it had once concealed. We were not long left in quiet contemplation. A sudden pounding at the door was followed by the sound of hurried boots upon the stairs. Mrs. Hudson's voice rose faintly in protest, but before she could complete her sentence, our door was flung open, revealing a man in clerical garb, drenched and trembling from crown to sole. His cassock clung to him like wet paper, the hem stained with London mud. Raindrops ran in rivulets from his collar down to the polished floorboards. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, voice catching in his throat. "I beg of you." Holmes raised a hand, calm and impassive. "You are Reverend Elias Merryweather," he said, "and you've come from Westminster." The man collapsed into the nearest chair without answering. "I do not ask you to believe it," the Reverend began, his eyes wide and glistening, "only to understand it, if you can." He wrung his hands as he spoke, his words tumbling forth with the desperation of a man clinging to the last rung of sanity. "Brother Arnold," he continued, "a Benedictine. He arrived but days ago to consult the archives. Last night, after evensong, he returned to his chamber in the south transept. This morning, nothing, no sign of forced entry, no open doors, no witness. He has vanished, Mr. Holmes." The silence was heavier than the storm outside. "Vanished," the Reverend whispered, as though the Abbey itself had swallowed him. Holmes said nothing, but I saw then the twitch in his upper lip, the first sign of interest. The clergyman's voice faltered, but Holmes did not urge him on. He merely sat back, folding his arms, his sharp features bathed in lamplight and shadow. There was something vulpine in the stillness of his gaze, an intelligence at rest, not in idleness, but in calculation. "I assume," he said at last, "that you have already inspected the grounds, questioned the staff, and scoured every plausible exit." "Yes, of course," Merryweather replied hoarsely. "And implausible ones?" The Reverend hesitated. "I thought as much," Holmes said. Then, with the faintest smile, he added, "No need to apologise, sir. The Abbey has long been known for hiding things not only spiritual. The Reverend's voice trembled, though he tried valiantly to contain it. Brother Arnold retired to his quarters after evensong, as was his custom, he began, wringing his thin hands in his lap. It was his last known movement. By Compline, he was nowhere to be found. We searched every passage, every stairwell. The abbey doors were locked from within, the watchmen accounted for, and none of the lay staff had entered the east cloister since morning. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half-lidded in concentration. "No signs of struggle?" I asked. None. His cell was perfectly in order, bed untouched, slippers by the fire. It was as if the very stones of Westminster had swallowed him. Holmes raised one eyebrow but said nothing. "There are whispers, of course," Merryweather added with a glance towards the fire, "about the ancient crypts and the abbey's darker corners. But I am not a superstitious man, Dr. Watson." I glanced at Holmes, who had not yet moved. There was in his silence the same tension I had observed on those rare mornings when some dark chessboard of crime had begun to assemble itself in his mind. "It would not be quite the same matter," Merryweather went on, "were it not for the document Brother Arnold carried." I noticed Holmes' left hand twitch, almost imperceptibly. "A scroll," the Reverend explained, "an ancient Benedictine text supposedly authored by St. Anselm himself. Its provenance is debated, but if genuine, it would have, certain theological implications." Holmes opened his eyes. "Implications?" "Disturbing ones to some. Heretical even," Merryweather admitted. "But it was not for me to judge. The Archbishop was to examine it. Brother Arnold was to present it before a gathering of senior clergy next week." "And the scroll is missing?" I asked. "Yes, and not even its case remains." Holmes stood suddenly and moved to the window. He peered out as if watching the rain offered more answers than Merryweather's tale. "Fascinating," he murmured, almost to himself. Reverend Merryweather looked from Holmes to me, as though uncertain whether he had just unburdened his soul or made himself ridiculous. I too had my doubts, and yet I had come to learn that it was often in the wildest corners of a story where Holmes found the straightest road. Every access point, Merryweather insisted, was locked and sealed. The sacristan has the only keys, and his whereabouts that evening are beyond dispute. The abbey is guarded overnight, and there was no sign of forced entry or departure. We even questioned the verger, who has a fondness for sherry. Holmes interjected quietly, his back still to us. Merryweather blinked. "Yes. How did you—" "It clings to your collar, Reverend. You sat beside him recently and leaned leftward, hence the faint crease on your sleeve." He turned from the window. "What is of more interest is not what your verger drinks, but what he didn't see. An abbey filled with silence is a perfect hiding place, provided one knows how to move quietly." I could not help but interject. "But surely, Holmes, such an escape would require superhuman knowledge of the building's every shadow. Or," he said with a faint smile, "an insider's map." Reverend Merryweather shifted uncomfortably. "There was no sound, no struggle, no footfall?" Holmes asked again. "None." Holmes returned to the hearth. "Then Brother Arnold either walked through stone or through knowledge." It was then Holmes beckoned Merryweather forward with a flick of his hand. "You've brought a great deal more with you than fear, Reverend," he said calmly. "Let us consider your attire. I beg your pardon. Your hem is streaked with soot and a pale flake of lime. Rare, unless one has stooped near an old furnace chute. There's beeswax on your right cuff just beneath the wrist, perhaps from brushing a sconce while opening a door not meant to be opened." Merryweather paled visibly. "And this thread here?" Holmes plucked it with deliberate delicacy from the back of the man's shoulder. "Does not belong to your cassock, nor to any cloth typically worn in ecclesiastical circles. It is canvas, coarse, likely from an old rope satchel. My guess is you dislodged it while leaning against stone or iron." Merryweather's mouth opened and closed twice. I merely sought to verify that the monk had not hidden himself in some unused chamber. Indeed, and you found? An old iron door behind the crypt stair. I had not known it was still accessible. Was it? It opened at my touch. Holmes made a sound between a hum and a whisper. So the Abbey keeps its secrets well, until someone thinks to knock. You did not come to me solely because of Brother Arnold's disappearance, Holmes said after a moment. You came because something else frightened you when you opened that door. I don't know what you mean. You do, Holmes said simply, because you locked it behind you. You turned the latch, Reverend, and even applied a little pressure. Your fingertips still bear the shallow impression of oxidized iron. Your hands shake now, but they did not tremble when you entered. You feared what you might find, more than what you had already lost. Merriweather slumped as though deflated. I heard movement, he whispered. Not loud, just deliberate, as if someone were waiting beyond. But when I returned with the verger, the door would not open again. It was sealed. Not from your side, Holmes said. The Reverend looked up. You've been in the Abbey 20 years, yet only now do you find a door you'd never noticed before. You're not telling me everything. There was a long pause. Holmes turned to me and smiled faintly. You see, Watson, he said, clergymen are not so unlike criminals. They both believe in confession. One just needs to apply the proper catechism. When the Reverend had gone, still visibly shaken despite Holmes' outward civility, I found myself examining my friend more closely. You believe him? I asked. I believe he has seen something that frightened him more than it should have, Holmes replied, lighting his pipe. Men of cloth are well acquainted with fear of the unseen, but it takes something truly tangible to disturb a rationalist. And you think the iron door leads somewhere. I know it does, he said simply. The question is, where and why now? He turned back toward the table, where he had earlier laid out the partially torn registry of the Abbey. His fingers traced the margin, particularly a note penned in faded red ink beside a monk's name crossed out twice. It is a curious thing, he murmured, how old buildings keep their secrets, and how those who live within them often prefer them kept. There was a sharpness in his tone now, rare and unmistakable. You formed a theory, I said. A fragment, he corrected, but enough to sharpen the blade. He tapped the registry twice and looked up. Pack your bag, Watson. We visit Westminster tomorrow. And bring your walking stick. Something tells me we may need to go underground. There are places in London that even the most hardened rationalist must enter with a certain reverence, and Westminster Abbey, shrouded in a hush older than any living tongue, is surely among them. Holmes walked ahead of me with deliberate slowness, his eyes not upon the soaring architecture or gilded arches, but upon the floor, the worn stones that had borne the procession of kings, poets, traitors, and more recently, a vanishing monk. He said very little, save a brief observation about the weight of history being as useful as a footfall in fresh snow. I understood him to mean that age alone could not obscure the trace of the present, provided one knew how to look. The verger greeted us respectfully, if a trifle nervously. Holmes declined his offer of a full tour, requesting instead to be left to his own devices in the east transept. Mr. Holmes, I asked under my breath, do you believe he truly vanished here? No one vanishes, Watson, he replied without looking back. They only pass beyond the sight of those not taught to follow. And with that, he knelt before a choir stall, brushing his fingertips across the carved edge, as though searching for memory etched in oak. Holmes rose slowly and gestured for me to follow him around the edge of the choir. He moved with a hunter's caution, every stride measured, his gaze fixed, not at eye level, but downward. There, he murmured, pointing to the edge of a flagstone where a faint depression lay upon the settled dust. I squinted. A footprint. A partial one, he said. And what is more, it is not that of a monk. How can you tell? He motioned again, this time with greater purpose. Observe the pressure at the heel, too firm, and the angle of the outer edge. See how it flares slightly. That's a sign of someone trained in formation marching, a soldier or one who has been drilled as such. But the robes? Any man can don vestments, Watson. Not every man can forget his gait. Holmes bent down and examined a second smudge barely visible. He moved confidently, quickly. This was not the stagger of a frightened man, but the pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going. I felt a chill crawl up my neck, despite the warmth of the chapel. Then we are dealing not with a lost brother, I said slowly, but a man in costume. Holmes smiled faintly. And now you begin to see him. We moved deeper into the cloisters, where the very air seemed reluctant to stir. Holmes paused beside the chapter house and placed his palm against a section of worn masonry. Feel that? He asked quietly. I obeyed, and to my surprise felt a subtle draught, barely perceptible, but unmistakably cool against my fingers. Holmes crouched and brushed the base of the wall with a folded handkerchief. He held it up, revealing a thin line of fresh dust. A recent shift, he said. Look here. He pointed to a hairline crack in the mortar and a faint scuff at the base, like someone had braced themselves against the wall. A loose flagstone, perhaps, or a concealed entrance. But why hide it? Surely the Abbey's architecture is well known. Holmes's eyes glinted. You'd be surprised how much survives by being forgotten. He tapped the stone twice, and somewhere beneath us, I thought I heard the suggestion of hollow space. He rose without further comment and turned back toward the vestry. There was something in his manner that made me uneasy, not because he looked lost, but because he clearly wasn't. The sacristan, a bent and sharp-eyed man named Barrow, received us in the vestry. His voice was dry as paper, but not without its share of pride. I've walked these cloisters since Her Majesty was a girl, he said. If there were ghosts here, I'd know their habits. Holmes inclined his head politely. It is not ghosts I inquire after, but men. Barrow nodded toward the pewed corridor. Then you'll find no shortage of those either. Holmes asked with remarkable gentleness if any disturbances had been noticed on the night of Brother Arnold's disappearance. Barrow hesitated. Well, he said, Father Gell said he heard tapping, soft but regular, just after the 10th bell. Thought it was rats in the eaves. Holmes smiled. Rats wear boots now? Barrow chuckled despite himself. Suppose not, sir. And what of the evening meal? Holmes continued. Any quarrels, ill humours? The sacristan pursed his lips. The new guest, Sir Cedric Blackmore. He and Brother Arnold had words. About relics and scrolls. Blackmore's a clever one, but talks like a man who's read too much and prayed too little. Holmes looked over at me. Interesting how theology and forgery so often walk the same corridor, is it not? We found Sir Cedric Blackmore in the Abbey's guest quarters, seated beneath a tall window, thumbing through a bound volume of medieval Latin. He rose when introduced, his manner cool and superior. I assume you are the famous detective, he said to Holmes, and your chronicler. Indeed, Holmes replied. May we borrow a moment of your unimpeachable time? Blackmore raised a brow, but gestured toward a chair. Holmes remained standing. I'm told you and Brother Arnold had a disagreement. An academic exchange, Blackmore replied. He took issue with my interpretation of the so-called scroll of St. Anselm. I suggested it might not be as ancient or as spiritually potent as he believed. And where were you between the hours of 8 and 10 the night he vanished? Blackmore frowned. In the library, reading. Alone? Yes, the monks had retired. Their hours are less ambitious than mine. Holmes folded his arms. The Abbey clock struck 10 that night. You recall it? I do. And yet you state you were near the east wing, where the bell's chime is muffled. Blackmore hesitated. Perhaps I misremember. Holmes nodded slightly. Most men do, when standing on unsteady ground. As we left, he whispered to me, There is a lie there, Watson, not told in words, but in breath. Back in the nave, Holmes asked to see the Abbey's architectural plans. After some resistance, the archivist, a nervous, stammering man named Fields, produced a yellowing sheaf bound with wax thread. Holmes studied the diagrams with the intensity of a man deciphering music. "Here," he said, pointing to a shaded section beneath the choir stalls. "This passage leads beneath the eastern transept, but there's no corresponding outlet in the current structure." "Collapsed," I offered. "Concealed," Holmes corrected. "Note the double thickness of the wall here. An illusion of solidity, common in medieval constructions designed to mask crypts or storage cells." The archivist peered over his shoulder. "That passage was sealed in the reign of Edward VI, I believe." "Which means it was once open," Holmes replied. "Sealed passages do not erase their own footprints." He returned the plan and began pacing, his fingers tapping thoughtfully against his leg. "You think someone used it?" I asked. Holmes gave a faint smile. "I think someone never stopped." It was a curious notion that a path once trod by monks could still echo with feet in modern times. And yet, as we stood there beneath the stone saints and silent arches, I felt the history press against us like breath in the dark. We descended once more toward the east transept, Holmes growing more animated with each step, like a man moving toward a long-pursued quarry. He stopped abruptly beside a small iron grating set low into the wall. "This was a vent," he said, "part of the Abbey's early system for air circulation. But look." He indicated a faint scrape on the stone beside it, no larger than a coin. "Someone opened it recently." "Someone opened it often," Holmes replied. "The iron is worn smooth at the lip, and the scrape is fresh. There's a mechanism inside, I would wager." He tapped the stone twice and then turned away with a satisfied air. "You found the entrance," I said. "I found the route," he replied. "The entrance will reveal itself tonight." I looked at him, puzzled. "You expect him to return?" "I do." "And what do we do in the meantime?" Holmes pulled out his watch and smiled with that peculiar light in his eye I had learned to both respect and fear. "We wait, Watson. Patience is the foundation of any sound trap. That and silence." He turned back to the Abbey's silent stones, eyes fixed not on what stood before us, but what moved behind it. "There is a vault beneath this place," he said softly, "and I do not believe it is empty." It was late the next afternoon when Holmes returned from his morning's errand, with a telegram clutched between two fingers as though it were a rare artifact or an explosive. "Brother Arnold," he said without preamble, "has been dead for nearly 3 years." I looked up from my notes in astonishment. "Confirmed," he continued, tossing the message onto the table. "Benedictine Monastery, Monte Cassino, natural causes, buried in their own cloister garden." "Then who precisely, Watson? The man who vanished from Westminster was no more a monk than I am a martyr. He wore robes, yes, and used the right name. But his soul, I suspect, would not pass inspection even by the most lenient of confessors." The message was brief but definitive, including the burial registry and witness signatures. There was no doubt. Whoever had donned Brother Arnold's habit in London was a fraud, and a remarkably bold one at that. Holmes lit his pipe with a flick of his match. "It is not the first time," he said, "that a man has found shelter behind holy cloth. But few dare to hide inside the very Abbey walls." "And to what end?" I asked. Holmes glanced toward the Abbey plans still spread across our table. "That," he said softly, "is what we are about to learn. But make no mistake, Watson, the Abbey has kept its secrets well, too well, and now it has lied twice." Over the next hour, Holmes unearthed from his private files a set of newspaper clippings, most yellowed and brittle with age, each fastened with his peculiar numbering system. "You remember the Grantley manuscript affair?" he asked. "Vaguely," I admitted. "It involved a forged document presented as part of the bishopric archives. an elaborate deception that nearly saw it canonized by ecclesiastical authorities. The fraud was uncovered before any damage was done, but the forger disappeared. His name never confirmed. He tapped one of the clippings. Here, witnesses described him as tall, soft-spoken, fluent in Latin and French, with a curious knowledge of sacred architecture. I leaned in. You think it's the same man? I think we are dealing with a craftsman of fraud, Watson. A man who learned not just to forge handwriting, but identity. And Blackmore? Holmes gave a dry smile. You heard the sacristan. They argued about relics. That is not a theological dispute. It is a matter of provenance and ownership. Blackmore, I believe, has walked this path before. He writes, he debates, and behind the scenes, he profits. And the impostor was his agent. Perhaps, or his rival. He turned one of the clippings around, revealing a faint watermark upon the newsprint. There are circles, Watson, where a rare scroll is worth more than a soul. And I suspect this man walked in such circles until Westminster swallowed him, robes and all. It was in the quiet of the vestry, while Holmes examined a crumbling choir book for marginalia, that I stumbled upon what I first mistook for a misplaced bookmark. Nestled within the Psalter's back pages, wrapped carefully in oilskin, was a parchment fragment, neatly folded, though brittle at the creases. Holmes, I said, offering it. He took it carefully, eyes narrowing. Not part of the original volume. See the ink, less faded. Upon unfolding it, we discovered a rudimentary map. It showed only part of the Abbey grounds, rough and somewhat childlike in execution, but there were marks upon it that caught Holmes's attention instantly. A red cross at the eastern transept, initials in Latin script at the base of a stair, and a dotted line leading nowhere. It's a fool's map, I offered. On the contrary, Holmes replied, it is the kind of map a man draws when he knows exactly what he's looking for and dares not write it plainly. The initials, AF, were repeated near a sketched doorway with no outward access. Arnold's forger, I guessed. Holmes gave a brief nod. Or ad fundamentum, to the foundation. He refolded the map with precision. Come, Watson, it appears someone left us directions. The question is whether they lead to treasure or a tomb. That evening, armed with the map and guided more by Holmes's instincts than any visible clue, we returned to the Abbey. He compared the crude parchment against the grand architectural plans, now better memorized than consulted. See here, he said, his finger trailing across a double wall structure that had puzzled him before. This space, it should not exist. He turned to the plan of the eastern transept, and here, a staircase shown descending from the vestry to the catacombs, but in the present-day building, there is no access at this point. He tapped both maps, aligning parchment over blueprint. They match, not in artistry, but in truth. We retraced our earlier steps to the base of the vestry stair. Holmes knelt, tapping along the wall with a firm knuckle. A dull tone, stone, another, hollow. There! He pressed against the panel, and with a faint grinding, a narrow recess gave way. Dust and silence greeted us. A passage, I breathed. To somewhere forgotten, Holmes added. He stood with the grace of a man satisfied. I do not yet know what lies at its end, Watson, but I know this. Our impostor did not vanish. He descended. And with a glance towards the opening, he added, almost to himself, stone makes no sound when it closes behind you, but it remembers. Holmes spent the better part of that evening in monastic silence, tracing the alignment of the Abbey's stonework with the map we had found. The scratchings on the parchment, crude though they appeared, began to reveal a pattern under his scrutiny, one which spoke not of nonsense or guesswork, but of familiarity. It's a tunnel, he said at last, spreading both diagrams side by side. It does not run directly, but in a shallow arc beneath the nave, precisely here. I followed his gaze to a thickened section of the Abbey plan, once presumed solid foundation. It was sealed at some point, I believe. Perhaps during the Reformation, perhaps earlier, but not destroyed. The vault beneath still exists. And what would be in such a place? That, Holmes replied, is the question our missing man sought to answer. He stood, lighting his pipe with unhurried ease. Imagine, Watson, a relic hidden not simply by dust or darkness, but by deliberate historical omission. If this scroll challenges church doctrine, then it is more dangerous hidden than exposed. And the man impersonating Brother Arnold was never interested in faith, Holmes replied, but in recovery or theft. He pointed to a faint sigil on the map, barely legible, a mark of possession. Whoever drew this considered what lay beneath not a relic of worship, but a prize to be claimed. Holmes tapped the end of his pipe against the hearth, sending a fleck of ash into the air like punctuation on a silent sentence. This case, Watson, he said, was never about a disappearance. It was about an approach. An approach to something precious. The impersonation, the scroll, the arguments with Blackmore, these were smoke. The true flame lies beneath Westminster. But surely, I said, if the scroll were that valuable, others would have pursued it. They have, he said simply, but few with the nerve to step into holy ground under false pretenses. He turned the map once more toward me. Note the sequence of initials here, AF. We considered might refer to the forger, but it is also the Latin abbreviation for ad fundamentum. To the foundation, the scroll was never meant to be shown, it was meant to be retrieved. I felt the tension rise. And you believe the impostor found it? I believe he is close, and we are closer still. He removed a thin iron tool from his coat pocket and held it up between two fingers. This was left beside the vestry grating, old locksmith's work, finely shaped. Whoever used it intended to return, and likely tonight. I caught the meaning in his voice. You've set a trap. Holmes's eyes gleamed. We do not hunt a holy man, Watson. We hunt a thief. And unlike monks, thieves return to their spoils. We returned to Westminster Abbey under cover of dusk, accompanied by Inspector Lestrade and a sergeant from Scotland Yard. The sacristan had, under Holmes's persuasion, arranged for the premises to remain locked from the outside, while giving us free access to the vestry and choir. Holmes moved like a man completing the final stroke of a chess match already won. We'll take position here, he said softly, pointing to the screen behind the side altar. When the impostor returns, he'll believe the Abbey undisturbed. He will descend. And if he does not, Lestrade asked, then I've grossly overestimated his greed. Holmes turned to me then, a flicker of dry amusement in his eye. You've brought your revolver, I trust? Of course. Good. I suspect this evening's quarry may prefer escape to confession. We waited nearly 2 hours in that chill gloom. I could hear the settling of the stones above us, the occasional whisper of wind through the stained glass. Then, faint, deliberate, the scrape of metal on stone. Holmes signalled with a single nod. We crept forward in silence, following the sound through the hidden passage we had uncovered days earlier. And there he was, clad once again in clerical robe. The impostor knelt beside a lifted panel, sack at his side and crowbar in hand. He did not hear us until Holmes's voice broke the hush. An odd time for prayer, brother. The man spun, too late. Holmes stepped forward, calm as ever. You've taken from the church's cellar, sir, but the cost shall be measured above. Lestrade clamped the irons down, and the thief said nothing, but his eyes, hard and knowing, met Holmes's for a single second, and then dropped. I had seen that look before. It was the look of a man caught by someone who had never been chasing blindly. Holmes was never more composed than when calamity flirted at the edges of silence. That evening, beneath the dim vault of the Dean's library, I found myself studying the curve of his hands folded neatly over one knee, while Lestrade paced noiselessly along the wall. The trapdoor beneath the Persian rug had been uncovered, though still closed, and the stone tiles of around it bore faint smudges Holmes had earlier pointed out with a kind of reverent disdain. "Someone's been here more than once," he murmured. "Note the scuffing, consistent pressure across the flagstone, not hurried, not fearful." "And how recent?" I asked. "Recent enough," Holmes replied, "that our man would feel confident returning. If he feared discovery, he would have sealed it." Lestrade, ever sceptical, sniffed. "You believe he'll come back for whatever he didn't carry out the first time?" Holmes inclined his head. "I believe men rarely resist finishing what they have risked their soul to begin." We crouched in silence, each with our appointed place behind the darkened shelves, revolver close at hand. Outside, the bells of Westminster struck 11 with an almost ceremonial calm. Holmes touched my shoulder lightly. "When he enters, let him descend. Do not move too early. And if he escapes, he won't," Holmes said softly. "I've seen to that." And then he smiled, a smile I had seen before. It did not comfort me. It merely assured me something irreversible had been set in motion. It was 12 minutes past midnight when the door creaked. No knock, no prayer. Only the gentle protest of an old hinge giving way to a confident hand. Holmes stiffened beside me, but gave no signal. A shaft of soft lamplight fell across the floor as a tall figure stepped into the chamber, clothed once more in Benedictine black, the cowl drawn low. He moved with the self-assurance of a man returning to a hiding place, not exploring a danger. His right hand held a lantern. His left gripped a leather satchel, worn, bulging, and fastened with twine. He crossed the room without pause and knelt at the rug. With 2 swift motions, he folded it aside and produced a small iron key from his sleeve. The mechanism clicked, and the stone trapdoor yielded. Holmes's breath never altered, nor did the glint in his eye falter. The figure swung the trap open and descended carefully, his boots barely making a sound on the old iron rungs. The lantern vanished beneath the floor, leaving behind a triangle of shifting light and the scent of tallow. Holmes leaned toward Lestrade and whispered, "Now." We followed in silence. There was no time for fear, only purpose. As we slipped through the open hatch, I caught a final glimpse of the satchel he carried. Its leather was cracked, but its weight suggested iron or something older. Holmes went last, securing the hatch behind us. "He believes himself alone," he said. "That shall be our advantage, until it isn't." The descent was long, and the air turned heavy with the perfume of damp stone and forgotten ages. Holmes's lantern swung carefully ahead, catching faint glimmers of inscriptions carved into the walls, Latin mottos and weathered crosses, some chiselled so deeply they seemed to bleed shadow. The tunnel sloped downward, the passage narrowing, winding in coils that betrayed its ancient origin. The man we followed moved with certainty, his own light dancing along the edges of archways long since claimed by dust. At one point, Holmes paused and touched the wall. "See here, Watson," he said, brushing away grit. "Carved by hand, 15th century, likely a chantry vault, sealed by decree, but not entirely buried. Why would such a place be left intact? Because no decree can erase what men choose to forget." Ahead of us, the impostor turned sharply and passed through a low arch. Holmes gestured for silence and quickened his pace, moving with the stealth of a man who knew the measure of both silence and confrontation. The walls closed tighter now. I could feel the age pressing in. The air grew cooler, and then we reached it. A chamber that opened like the belly of a cathedral, circular and domed, littered with fragments of rusted iron and fractured stone angels. At its centre, the impostor stood over a sunken alcove, prying at the stone. Holmes's voice was barely a whisper. "There, he's at the nest." "And us?" Holmes's lips barely moved. "We are the claw." The impostor did not hear our approach. His full attention was on the slab before him, which had already begun to tilt under the force of his crowbar. The satchel lay open at his side, revealing a length of rope, A second lantern and a parchment tube capped in brass. Holmes stepped into the chamber like a man arriving for a late appointment. "Forgive the intrusion, brother," he said, voice echoing softly against the vault. "But I believe the Abbey requires that relics be catalogued before removal." The man froze, then rose slowly, crowbar still in hand. He did not reach for the lantern. He did not run. "You followed me?" Holmes inclined his head. "As one follows a shadow cast by a false candle." The man's voice dropped lower. "You don't know what this is." "I know what it is not," Holmes replied. "It is not yours." A long pause. Then he turned, slowly, eyes pale and sharp beneath the edge of the cowl. "You're too late." Holmes stepped closer. "No, I am precisely in time." The impostor lunged, not toward us, but toward the alcove, snatching the satchel. But Lestrade moved faster than I would have credited, and the revolver in his hand barked once, a warning shot, clean and near. The crowbar clattered to the stone. The man sank to his knees. He did not beg, nor speak. Holmes regarded him with that cold, clinical gaze that I had seen dissect princes and porters alike. "You wore the robe," he said, "but your heart never belonged to the cloth." The impostor looked up with the faintest trace of defiance. "Nor does theirs." Holmes turned to me. "Take note, Watson, when the motive is not gold, nor power, but truth, men grow dangerous indeed." The man did not wait to be taken. Even as Lestrade stepped forward, he bolted, casting aside the satchel and disappearing through a narrow breach in the stone behind the alcove. One Holmes had noted, but not explored. "After him!" Lestrade cried. We followed into a twisting passage, low-roofed, slick with centuries of damp. The impostor was fast, unnervingly so, his robes flaring as he darted into a fork in the darkness. I slipped once on the moss-slick stone, catching myself only by Holmes's arm. His lantern bobbed ahead like a solitary will-o'-the-wisp. "He's heading toward the river exit," Holmes said calmly, almost conversationally. "The what?" Lestrade puffed behind us. "There's an old drain tunnel," Holmes replied, "once used to funnel overflow from beneath the Abbey during the spring tides. He believes it forgotten." "And is it?" I gasped. Holmes's smile was grim. "Not by me." The tunnel grew narrower, the walls running with moisture. We turned sharply and found ourselves before a grating, iron, rusted but strong, spanning the final stretch of tunnel. Beyond it lay darkness and the scent of wet stone. Our fugitive stood just before it, breathing hard, his hands pressed against the bars. He turned, teeth clenched. "You blocked it." Holmes nodded. "Earlier this afternoon." The man sagged. Holmes gestured to Lestrade. "Inspector, if you please." The irons clicked a moment later. As we turned to begin our slow march back through the tunnels, I glanced at Holmes. "You knew he'd come here." "Men who build exits," he said, "will always try them before they surrender." We had not yet returned to Baker Street when the telegram arrived. It was delivered by hand, the ink still wet, the boy breathless from his ride. Holmes took it wordlessly and opened it with a single flick of his thumb. His eyes moved across the page, then paused at the final line. He handed it to me. "Blackmore found dead. Hotel room. Poisoned whiskey. Glass in hand. Lestrade." I lowered the telegram slowly. "Suicide?" Holmes shook his head. "Not likely. Men who treasure rare documents do not take their own lives for shame." He was silenced. "But the impostor is in custody." "Indeed." "And yet..." Holmes paced to the fireplace, where the remains of a late supper still sat untouched. "Poison," he said quietly, "is a patient tool. Administered at the right hour, it needs no immediate witness." Then someone else, someone who had access to his rooms, someone who knew when the investigation would turn toward him. I felt the old chill return. "Holmes, do you mean..." "I mean," he said, "that our forger was clever, but he was not alone. Blackmore played patron, but someone else played conductor." He tapped the telegram once more. "Always beware of the quietest name in the ledger." It was Holmes who requested a final interview in the Abbey's archive chamber. Fields, the frail and meticulous archivist, was nowhere to be found. The keys are missing, the sacristan admitted. And the door's been locked since last evening. Holmes said nothing at first, merely examined the dust upon the desk and the empty key hook. His fingers ran lightly over the registry of visitors, pausing upon a name half smudged at the bottom. Here, he said, tapping. Entered alone, no exit recorded. But he must still be inside. No, Holmes replied. He left before the bell, and he will not return. It was then that I recalled the man's pale hands, his quiet step, and his eyes, always a little too still for one charged with so much knowledge. You suspected him? Holmes nodded. From the moment he hesitated at the blueprint. A man entrusted with Abbey records does not forget his own ink. Lestrade arrived shortly after, bearing news from the docks. A cabin reserved in Fields's name had gone unclaimed. Trunks were found aboard, one containing an ivory-handled quill, a false passport, and a second key to the Abbey's sealed vault. He never meant to stay, I murmured. No, said Holmes, and he didn't. But why vanish now? Holmes turned away. Because the scroll was never the goal. It was the bait. The moment it surfaced, men moved who had lain still for years. He looked back at the empty desk. And some men, he added quietly, write their names only once, and then erase them. It was 2 days later, in the familiar haze of pipe smoke at Baker Street, that Holmes saw fit to untangle the skein before me. He reclined in his armchair with the air of a man no longer chasing shadows, but rearranging them to his liking. The scroll, Watson, he began, was never lost. It was never in peril. It was, in fact, never truly removed from the Abbey at all. I looked up sharply from my notes. But the impostor, he carried something. That satchel, a decoy, Holmes said, weighted to suggest substance. The true artifact remains under lock, guarded by those with more sense than pride. But the illusion of a missing scroll served its purpose well enough. To draw out the thief. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. The impersonation of Brother Arnold was a mask. The goal was not publicity or revelation, but access. Access to the crypt, and more importantly, to the vault beneath. And Reverend Merriweather? An unwitting pawn, Holmes said. He stumbled upon a hidden passage and became frightened. Less by ghosts, I think, than by the thought of being implicated. His conscience brought him to us. I sat back, marvelling once again at the layers Holmes had peeled away. Then the entire performance, I said slowly, was staged to cloak a theft. Holmes nodded. And like all good theatre, Watson, it only works when the audience believes the illusion. Fortunately, I have never been one for drama, unless I am directing it. He blew a slow ribbon of smoke toward the ceiling. And in this case, our stage was most sacred. I asked Holmes what, precisely, had first tipped his mind from mystery to motive. He smiled faintly. A chant book, Watson, or rather, what was not in it. I waited. There was a missing folio, he said, but not one torn away, merely one replaced. The ink was too fresh, the binding slightly bowed. A concealed map had been tucked inside, a guide, if you will, for those who already knew what they were looking for. And you saw that at the Abbey. I saw its echo, Holmes replied. More importantly, I saw the residue on Merriweather's sleeve. Beeswax from an old candle sconce that had not been lit in decades. His denial of entering forgotten areas rang hollow. And the impostor was even less careful, Holmes said. He walked like a soldier, not a monk. His prints in the cloister dust were pressed at the heel and wide at the edge. A man trained in parade step cannot hide it, even in silence. I could not help but smile. And the crowbar? Recovered with the satchel, of course, and coated in residue from the vault door, a peculiar blend of iron flake and Abbey limestone. He reached for his pipe. The case was not built on what was taken, Watson. It was built on what was left behind. There was a pause. And that, he added, is where most criminals go astray. They forget that silence speaks, especially to those who are listening. Holmes had always held a peculiar respect for adversaries who employed intellect over violence. But as he leaned forward now, his voice dropped into that rare tone reserved for moral disgust. The impostor, he said, was no mere opportunist. He was a pupil of Blackmore, once a student of theology, later of forgery. A transition most unfortunate, I muttered. Holmes nodded. He was taught the forms of reverence, but not their substance. Blackmore saw in him not just potential, but profit. He educated him in languages, paleography, even ecclesiastical protocol, all the tools required to pass as a monk and move undetected. And the scroll? Holmes drew in a breath. It exists, yes. A 13th century tract with heretical assertions regarding apostolic succession. Dangerous? Perhaps. But in the hands of collectors, merely valuable. And the impostor sought to sell it? Indeed. But to sell it he needed access, and for access he needed disguise. The robes were not for cover, they were currency. I stared at the fire. To be trained in sacred scripture, I said, only to use it as a ladder into theft. Tragedy, Holmes agreed. But not uncommon. Minds trained to precision may, if starved of conscience, become razors turned inward. He stood and moved to the window, watching the passers-by on Baker Street. The Abbey may never know how close it came to scandal, he said, nor how much it owes to the arrogance of two men who believed themselves invisible beneath the cassock. And the one who taught him, Holmes turned from the window, is now silent, but the damage, as ever, was done in the lesson. What of the buyer? I asked at last. Holmes's gaze darkened, his voice lowering. That, Watson, is where the matter leaves the realm of the English law. He moved to the bookshelf and withdrew a slim folio bound in cracked leather. Baron von Arkenfeld, he said, tapping a name etched on the cover in faded gold. A Prussian antiquarian, officially retired. Unofficially, the shadow behind a dozen vanished relics. A smuggler. A gentleman smuggler, Holmes corrected. He operates from the continent, Rotterdam, sometimes Ghent. He deals only in originals. No forgeries, no questions. And he was the buyer. I believe so. The connection is indirect. A cable from Blackmore referencing a continental party prepared to pay in gold sovereigns. The phrase appears in other intercepted correspondences linked to Arkenfeld. But we cannot reach him. Not easily. He is cautious, and he purchases through proxies, museum curators, private brokers. But his pattern is clear. He trades in the rare, the hidden, the nearly mythic. Holmes closed the folio. This case, he said, never belonged solely to London. It was a ripple from older waters. The scroll was bait not only to the Abbey's secrets, but to those who swim where light does not reach. And what now? Holmes looked at me. Now we let the tide settle. But mark me, Watson, von Arkenfeld is not finished, and the next relic he seeks may not lie buried beneath stone, but within a man. Holmes had resumed his seat by the window, the afternoon light softening through the smoky pane, when I posed my final nagging question. But how, I asked, did you locate the crypt so precisely? Even the Abbey's own staff seemed uncertain. Holmes gestured lazily toward a rolled sheet upon the table. Because, my dear Watson, someone wished us not to find it. He unrolled the parchment, a copy of the Abbey's architectural plan, and tapped it twice. This blueprint was recently redrafted. Note here, an unnatural curve beneath the transept where none exists in the foundation. I have seen enough ecclesiastical layouts to know when a space has been intentionally masked. And who redrew the plan? The archivist, Holmes said with quiet finality, and with it, He hoped to erase a truth that stone itself could not forget. He leaned back. But what truly led me to the vault, Watson, was a stanza, half sung by Merriweather when we first arrived. I frowned. I recall no such verse. Where martyrs slept beneath the song, and lilies bloomed in voices long, Holmes recited, eyes half shut. It's a fragment from a Benedictine chant, harmless, unless one considers that lilies were the emblem carved exclusively beneath the choir stalls during the Abbey's reconstruction in 1324. I stared, and beneath those lilies, Holmes concluded, lay the crypt, sealed but not silenced. He smiled slightly, as if at some private symmetry. It is curious, he added, how even the past resists burial. A forged map may deceive the eye, but never the stone. I found myself reflecting aloud. And yet, Holmes, all this trouble, the disguises, the vault, the smuggling, was it worth a man's life? Holmes, whose hands had been calmly steepled, opened his eyes with a flicker of something too dry to be called amusement. My dear Watson, he said, you persist in assuming that death was part of the plan. I blinked. You mean Blackmore? Was not meant to die, at least not so soon, and not in that fashion. He reached for his pipe and tapped the bowl against the ashtray. The poison was a desperate measure, hastily deployed when the performance began to fray. Then it was an improvisation, I murmured. Holmes nodded. Misdirection, Watson. That was always the weapon. The monk's robe, the shadows in the crypt, even Merriweather's babbling, all designed to push us toward the supernatural and away from the secular. He paused. There are those who find it easier to believe in ghosts than in greed. But someone killed Blackmore. Yes, Holmes said simply, but not for revenge or anger, for silence. Because even villains have patrons, and Blackmore's tongue was beginning to wag. He leaned back, exhaling a long plume of smoke. Murder was never the aim, Watson. It was the cost of failure. And failure, for men who profit in darkness, is intolerable. The fire had burned low, casting amber hues across Holmes's cheek as he relit his pipe. I sat with my notes half written, unwilling to disturb the spell of completion that hung in the room. At last, Holmes spoke. It is not often, Watson, that I enjoy a case. I looked up, startled. You don't? He smiled faintly. Enjoyment is not my usual motive. The thrill of logic, the contest of minds. Yes, but pleasure, that is rare. I raised an eyebrow. And yet this one, a pleasing blend, Holmes said, of stone, shadow, and sin. It reminded me that the theatre of faith is not without its backstage mechanics. He gestured idly. There is an elegance to cloisters, echoes that obey, arches that conceal, stories etched not in ink, but in dust. You are almost poetic, Holmes. Architecture invites it, he replied. So do liars. I laughed softly, but Holmes was elsewhere, his gaze distant. Do you think the scroll will ever surface again? I asked. Holmes shook his head. Not unless Archenfeld grows careless. But men like him are not careless twice. And Merriweather? Will resign, I suspect. Not from guilt, but from having seen too much. There are truths which, once glimpsed, render the pulpit a poor place to stand. I fell silent for a time. You know, I said at last, you never told me why you took the case. You dismissed 3 that very same morning. Holmes gave a rare smile. Because, Watson, a monk disappeared through a locked door and left no footprints behind. Because a man wore robes that didn't quite fit. Because a candle hadn't dripped since the Restoration and yet left wax on a modern sleeve. He looked at me, and for a moment the mask of aloofness lifted. And because, he said, the truth, when buried long enough, becomes more valuable than gold. It was on one of those damp London evenings where the mist rises like a memory from the cobbles, curling in quiet wreaths along the Thames embankment, that Holmes and I took our customary stroll. He was uncharacteristically silent, hands clasped behind his back, eyes trained on some distant point the fog refused to reveal. We had spoken little since our return from the Abbey. The case had resolved, at least in form, but there remained in me a curious disquiet, as though we had unearthed something meant to remain buried, or worse, misunderstood. "Holmes," I said, after several paces, "do you believe the scroll would truly have changed anything? I mean, had it come to light?" He did not answer immediately. A lamplighter passed us by, his pole tapping gently against the gas fixture, then continued into the whiteness beyond. Holmes stopped, resting a hand on the rail, gazing into the river as though the answer might be written on its grey surface. "That," he said at last, "depends on whether you believe truth is a blade or a mirror." I turned toward him, puzzled. "You speak in riddles tonight." Holmes gave a faint smile. "No riddle, Watson, merely observation. There are truths which, when revealed, wound. Others reflect and are ignored. Most simply wait for the right light in which to be seen." He resumed walking. The scroll's content, I suspect, was more poetry than heresy. But poetry has long frightened institutions that mistake obedience for order. I remained silent, letting his words sink in. "And yet," he added, with a note of curiosity, "even suppressed knowledge has a peculiar tendency to surface, first as legend, then as whisper, and finally as footnote. One cannot erase what was once believed with fervour." The fog thickened around us as we walked, softening the world's edges until only our footsteps and the lapping river remained. I glanced at him and found his face unreadable. "You do not fear such truths?" I asked. Holmes gave a quiet laugh. "I fear boredom, Watson. The rest, truth, myth, dogma, are merely puzzles in disguise." Holmes suddenly chuckled, low and genuine. "Imagine it, Watson. Westminster nearly brought to ruin by an actor in borrowed robes and a counterfeit map. One might expect such things in a playhouse, not a pulpit." The unexpected levity made me smile. "And yet we chased ghosts through a cathedral." "We did," he nodded, "and found only shadows cast by greed. The impostor's flair for performance, Blackmore's ambition, the archivist's quiet betrayal, all threads in a tapestry woven with vanity." He paused. "You see, Watson, every man in that abbey wanted to protect something. Reputation, legacy, memory. And all were undone by illusion. Even us." Holmes tilted his head. "We? No. We merely wandered through their theatre with the curtain half raised." The river below us murmured on. "It is the great folly of mankind," he added, "to believe that truth must be grand. Often it arrives in farcical costume." Holmes was reaching for his cigarette case when a small boy approached, breathless, envelope in hand. "A message for Mr. Holmes, sir." Holmes accepted it without thanks, tore the seal, and scanned the telegram. I watched his brows rise by the faintest degree. "Well?" I asked. "Venice," he replied. "An urgent matter. Murder among ruins." I blinked. "Ruins?" He folded the message neatly and tucked it into his coat. "Curious place for fresh blood," he murmured. "But then, Watson, history is fond of repetition." His tone was light, but I saw that familiar gleam, half mischief, half precision, return to his eye. And just like that, the fog thickened anew. I sighed, more from fond resignation than fatigue, and tucked away my notebook. "There goes our quiet week." Holmes smiled, not unkindly. "No rest for the rational, Watson." "And none," I said, glancing up at him, "for those who chronicle them." He tipped his hat. "An honourable burden." We turned from the embankment and disappeared into the mist, two figures swallowed by the city's breath. The gaslights blinked behind us like watchful eyes, and though the case of the cloistered scroll had closed, I felt, as I often did, that we had merely turned the page on one chapter of a much older tale. Some truths, after all, do not fade, they only wait. As the fog thickened along the embankment and our boots tapped a rhythm upon the damp flagstones, I could not help but glance sidelong at Holmes. He walked with his hands behind his back, his profile thoughtful, sharp against the gaslight's haze. "It is curious, Watson," he murmured, "how men cloak greed in grandeur, how a theft, no matter how scholarly or shrouded in ritual, is still a theft. But even the most intricate deception cannot outrun reason." "You mean the map, the robe, the chance?" "Just theatre?" I asked. "A performance, yes, but like all performances, it leaves behind footprints. Dust, wax, silence, where there should be song. Reason, my dear Watson, is the great auditor of illusions." What do you think was the impostor's greatest mistake? Trusting his mentor, underestimating Holmes, or believing that the Abbey itself would stay silent? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm curious to know what you would have done in Holmes' shoes. And if this mystery stirred your imagination, do subscribe for more tales where shadow and logic collide. Until next time, share this story with a fellow mystery lover, and keep your eyes sharp, for the fog always returns.